Jake had been at home all day, enjoying the rare tranquility of his house after a hectic week of work. He had been looking forward to some quiet time, just him and his thoughts. His routine was simple, the same as it had always been. He sat on his couch, flicking through a magazine, the soft hum of the house providing a sense of calm. There was no rush, no noise, just peace. But then, out of nowhere, he heard it. The creaking sound of his front door opening. At first, he thought it was just the wind. Maybe something had shifted with the breeze outside. But then, he noticed something strange. When he glanced out the window, he saw that the driveway was empty. There were no cars, no signs of anyone coming or going. And yet, the front door to his house, was wide open. His heart rate quickened slightly as his mind started racing. Jake wasn't someone who panicked easily, but something about this didn't sit right with him. He had made sure to lock up before settling in for the day, and the door was secure when he had checked it last. He stood up, setting the magazine aside, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of what was happening. As he moved closer to the door, he could hear muffled voices inside. They were soft at first, so faint that he could barely make them out, but they were there. He froze, his instincts kicking in. Someone was in his house. And it wasn't just any random person, it was Karen's son. Jake's heart skipped a beat at the thought. He had heard rumors about Karen's son, how he was spoiled, entitled, and always used his mother's position in the HOA as a shield to get whatever he wanted. But this was different. This wasn't a simple argument over a fine or a property issue. This was trespassing. Jake's stomach twisted with a mix of anger and unease as he stood motionless, listening to the voices. They were coming from deeper inside the house, probably the living room, and it sounded like Karen's son was talking. But he wasn't just talking to himself. Jake's mind spun with the possibilities. Was he here to take something? Was he trying to break into the house for some reason? The more Jake thought about it, the angrier he became. He had dealt with Karen's endless complaints for months. Her constant interference with his property, the HOA fines, the way she always thought she was above everyone else because of her position. Now, her son was in his house, violating his space, and Jake wasn't about to let that slide. He moved quickly but quietly toward the hallway, trying to stay out of view. He needed to know what was going on, but he couldn't just rush in without knowing if Karen's son was alone. He crept toward the entrance of the living room, trying to make himself as small as possible, his breath steady, his body tensed. The voices grew clearer as he neared. He could hear the unmistakable sound of Karen's son talking, though he couldn't make out the words just yet. Jake crouched low, staying out of sight, his eyes peering around the corner. What he saw made his blood boil. Karen's son was standing near the middle of the room, pacing back and forth. He had his back to the door, which gave Jake the perfect opportunity to watch him without being seen. The young man was rifling through drawers, flipping through papers on the coffee table. He seemed to have no concern for what he was doing, as if he had every right to be there. Jake's anger flared as he realized that Karen's son had completely crossed the line. But it was what he heard next that made his blood run cold. Karen's son muttered something under his breath, too quietly for Jake to hear at first. But then, he heard it clearly, "My mom runs the HOA. I can do whatever I want." Jake's fists clenched. The arrogance in his voice, the belief that his mother's position gave him the right to do whatever he pleased, it made Jake's stomach turn. This wasn't just a kid breaking into someone's house. It was a sense of entitlement that had gone unchecked for far too long. Jake's mind raced, his thoughts spinning with frustration and anger. He had dealt with Karen's manipulations before, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't just an HOA issue or a neighborly spat. This was personal. And Jake wasn't going to let it slide. His pulse quickened as he realized the full extent of what was happening. Karen's son had no idea that Jake was in the house, watching him. He was going about his business, as though this was normal, as though he could just walk into someone's home and do whatever he pleased because of who his mother was. Jake could feel the tension building in his chest. He knew he had to do something, but rushing in without thinking could make things worse. He needed a plan. Quietly, he reached into his pocket for his phone, pulling it out without making a sound. He couldn't let Karen's son get away with this. His first instinct was to call the police, but he knew he needed to be smart about it. He quickly sent a text to his neighbor, asking if they had seen anything unusual. If anyone could confirm that Karen's son had been acting suspicious lately, it would help him later. But for now, Jake had to stay hidden, watching every move the young man made. Karen's son continued to move around the house, his voice getting louder, more confident. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, as if he had all the time in the world to do whatever he wanted. Jake clenched his jaw, watching the scene unfold in front of him. He didn't know what Karen's son was after. Was he looking for something valuable? Or was he just looking to cause trouble, testing the boundaries of what he could get away with? Either way, Jake wasn't going to let it happen. He had put up with enough from Karen and her constant interference in his life. Now, her son had crossed the line, and Jake was determined to make sure there were consequences. Karen's son took a few more steps, still oblivious to Jake's presence, still carrying on like this was his home. But it was at that moment that Jake's phone buzzed again. It was a message from his neighbor, confirming that Karen's son had been acting strange for weeks, showing up uninvited, making demands as though he had a right to do whatever he wanted. Jake's anger flared again. This wasn't just a kid being careless. This was the product of entitlement, of someone who thought they could break the rules because of who they were connected to. And Jake wasn't going to let that kind of behavior go unchecked any longer. Jake's heart was pounding, but he forced himself to stay calm. The situation was spiraling, and he had to think fast. Karen's son, completely unaware of Jake's presence, was still going through his things, rifling through drawers as if he had every right to be there. Jake's anger simmered beneath the surface, but he knew he couldn't act recklessly. He stayed hidden, eyes locked on the intruder as Karen's son muttered to himself, too absorbed in his search to notice anything around him. His earlier words, "My mom runs the HOA, I can do whatever I want," echoed in Jake's mind. The audacity of it all. The young man thought his mother's position in the HOA gave him some kind of immunity. He believed he could do whatever he wanted, walk into someone's home, and not face any consequences. Jake clenched his fists, every fiber of his being wanting to rush in and confront the young man. But that would be a mistake. The last thing Jake needed was for this situation to escalate further. He had to be smarter than that. Max, his loyal K9, had been quiet until now, sensing the tension in the room. Jake glanced down at him, silently giving the dog a command to stay put. Max obeyed, his posture alert, but he knew better than to make a move without Jake's signal. The last thing Jake needed was for the situation to go sideways. He needed to act, but carefully. Still hidden in the shadows, Jake reached for his phone. His fingers were steady, but inside, his thoughts were racing. He couldn't just let Karen's son get away with this. He dialed the police, but after a moment of hesitation, he hung up. They wouldn't be able to act fast enough, not without concrete evidence. Jake needed to keep his cool. He needed more information before he could make a move. Slowly, he typed a quick message to his neighbor, explaining the situation and asking if they had seen Karen's son acting suspiciously over the past few days. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes as Jake kept his eyes fixed on the young man. Karen's son was still busy rummaging through the house, clearly acting like he owned the place. He had no idea Jake was watching him, no idea that he had crossed a line. Jake's mind wandered briefly to the times Karen had made his life miserable, her constant demands, her complaints to the HOA, and her unwavering belief that she could control everything around her. This wasn't just about the house. It was about putting an end to that sense of entitlement. Karen had created a monster in her son, and now that monster was in Jake's home, threatening to take what didn't belong to him. The rage was building inside Jake, but he kept it in check. He had to stay patient. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake received a response from his neighbor. The message was short and to the point. Yes, he's been acting strange, showing up uninvited. He's definitely trouble. Jake's jaw clenched, and he typed a quick reply, "Call the cops. I'll handle it until they arrive." He felt a small sense of relief. At least someone was backing him up. But that didn't change the fact that Karen's son was still inside his home, still trespassing and making himself at home. Jake couldn't just sit back and wait any longer. He had to confront him. But how? He couldn't let this go on any longer. He had to make a move. Slowly, Jake crept toward the living room door, making sure not to make a sound. His eyes were fixed on Karen's son, who was now standing near the kitchen, looking through the cabinets as if he had the right to take whatever he wanted. Jake knew that he couldn't wait any longer. He had to act now. He took a deep breath and stepped into the living room, just enough for his presence to be known. Karen's son froze, hearing the movement behind him. For a moment, everything stood still. Then, in a voice filled with disbelief and shock, Karen's son turned to face Jake. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his eyes wide, panic starting to creep into his tone. "This is my house," Jake replied, his voice calm but firm. "And you have no right to be here." The young man opened his mouth to protest, but Jake didn't give him a chance to speak. "You need to leave. Now." Karen's son hesitated, his face contorting with frustration. "My mom's in charge of the HOA, he spat, as though that would somehow justify his actions. "You can't tell me what to do." Jake's anger flared again, but he kept his composure. "I don't care who your mom is," he said. "You're trespassing, and you're leaving." For a moment, Karen's son looked like he might argue, but the reality of the situation began to sink in. He was in the wrong, and he knew it. He hadn't expected this confrontation. He had thought he could just walk in, take whatever he wanted, and leave. But Jake wasn't about to let him get away with it. The tension was thick in the air, and Jake's patience was wearing thin. The last thing he wanted was a physical altercation, but he couldn't let this go. He was done with Karen's son's sense of entitlement, and he wasn't about to back down. But before Jake could say anything else, the sound of sirens in the distance grew louder. The police were finally on their way. Jake felt a small wave of relief. It wouldn't be long now. But the question was, would Karen's son try to run? Would he try to make a break for it, knowing that he was caught? Jake stood his ground, ready for whatever was coming next. His eyes locked with Karen's son's, and he could see the realization start to sink in. The cops were coming, and there was nowhere for him to go. The sound of sirens grew louder, and Jake's heart raced, but he kept his cool. Karen's son stood frozen in the living room, his face twisting from anger to fear as the reality of his situation set in. Jake wasn't going to back down, and it seemed like the young man was beginning to realize just how much trouble he was in. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His usual arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a creeping panic. The door to the house was still wide open, and the flashing lights outside were a clear signal that things were about to take a dramatic turn. Jake's eyes never left Karen's son as he slowly backed toward the door, his hands trembling slightly, clearly unsure of what to do next. "You don't have to do this," Karen's son finally muttered, his voice shaky. "I didn't do anything wrong. My mom runs the HOA. She'll fix this." Jake's patience was running thin, but he didn't show it. "Your mom can't save you now," he said firmly, stepping closer. "You're trespassing, and that's a crime." Karen's son swallowed hard, looking at the door as though he might make a break for it. But he knew, just like Jake did, that the police were already on their way. His escape would be short-lived. "I'll leave, okay? Just don't call the cops," he pleaded, his voice no longer confident, but desperate. Jake shook his head. "You don't get to walk away from this," he said, his voice steady and filled with authority. "You've crossed the line. And now you're going to face the consequences." As he spoke, the sound of the sirens grew closer. Karen's son's panic deepened, and Jake could see his mind racing. It was clear now that the reality of his situation was finally sinking in. "You can't just call the cops on me," he shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. "You don't know who I am." But Jake wasn't fazed by his outburst. He knew exactly who Karen's son was, a spoiled, entitled kid who thought the world owed him everything, just because his mother ran the HOA. And now, that sense of invincibility was shattering in front of him. The two men who had been with Karen's son earlier in the day had already left, their involvement in the situation apparently over. The young man was alone now, and Jake knew that the longer he stood there, the more he would lose control of the situation. "You don't understand," Karen's son muttered, trying to find an escape. "My mom's going to fix this. She always does." Jake's gaze hardened. "Not this time," he replied. The sirens grew louder still, and Jake knew that in a few moments, everything would change. He had done what he could. He'd kept his composure, he'd stayed calm, and now the law was going to take over. He could feel his chest tighten with anticipation as the sound of the police car skidding to a stop outside echoed through the quiet street. Karen's son took one last step toward the door, but as he reached for the knob, the sound of footsteps behind him made him freeze. The police officers were here. The door opened with a bang, and two officers stepped inside, their presence filling the room. Jake stepped aside, making sure the officers could see the situation clearly. The young man, still frozen by the door, turned to face them. "What's going on here?" one of the officers asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Karen's son opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. "I didn't," he started, but the officer cut him off. "You're under arrest for breaking and entering," the officer said calmly, his hand reaching for the handcuffs. "You don't have to say anything, but anything you do say can be used against you in court." Karen's son's face went pale. "No, you can't, my mom," but the officer didn't respond. He just moved swiftly, handcuffing the young man and leading him toward the door. Jake watched it all unfold, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. It was over. Karen's son had learned the hard way that his mother's position in the HOA didn't give him the right to break the law. The officer led the young man outside, and Jake could hear his protests growing fainter as they moved down the driveway. "I'll make sure she knows about this," Karen's son shouted, his voice filled with anger. "You'll regret this." But Jake knew the truth. There would be no escaping the consequences this time. As the squad car pulled away, Jake felt a sense of relief. It wasn't just about getting rid of Karen's son. It was about standing up for what was right, for not allowing someone to walk all over him just because of who they were connected to. He turned to Max, who had been silently watching the whole ordeal. "We did it, buddy," Jake said, his voice soft but filled with satisfaction. Max gave a soft bark, as if in agreement. Jake walked back inside, closing the door behind him. The house felt different now, quieter, as if the weight of the situation had been lifted. But he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. There would be more to come, but for now, at least, Jake had one. The door slammed shut behind Karen's son as the officer led him to the squad car, and the sound seemed to echo through Jake's house, leaving an uneasy silence in its wake. Jake stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold, his mind still processing everything that had just happened. It wasn't over yet, but for now, he had one. He had stood up for himself, and the law had backed him up. But the tension in the air still hung heavy, like a storm that hadn't fully passed. Jake turned back into the house, feeling a mix of relief and uncertainty. The situation had escalated so quickly. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, he was enjoying a quiet afternoon at home, only to have it interrupted by Karen's son breaking in, acting as if he owned the place. As Jake moved through the house, his eyes landed on the place where Karen's son had been moments before, rifling through drawers and acting with complete entitlement. The anger still simmered inside him, but there was also a strange feeling of satisfaction. He had done what needed to be done. But then, just as Jake thought he could finally relax, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting a message from his lawyer or maybe his neighbor, confirming what had just happened. But when he saw the name on the screen, his stomach dropped. It was Karen. The message was short, but it made Jake's blood run cold. "You'll pay for this. You haven't heard the last of me." Jake stared at the screen, reading the words over and over again. It wasn't a surprise. He had known this was coming. Karen didn't like to lose control, and now that her son had been arrested, she was sure to come after him. Jake felt a wave of frustration wash over him, but he didn't let it show. He had dealt with Karen's threats before. But this time, things were different. Karen had crossed a line by sending her son into his home, and Jake wasn't going to let her get away with it. With a deep breath, Jake hit the reply button, typing quickly, "Your son broke into my house. The law doesn't care about your HOA position. Deal with it." He pressed send, and as he looked at the phone, he couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. There was no turning back now. Jake knew Karen wouldn't let it slide. She was relentless, always finding ways to manipulate the system. But now, she had no one to blame but herself. She couldn't hide behind her power, her status, or her son's mistakes anymore. Karen had made a grave error, and Jake was determined to make sure it didn't go unnoticed. Jake put the phone down and walked over to Max, who was lying on the floor, his head resting on his paws. Jake knelt down beside him and scratched the dog behind the ears, taking a moment to appreciate the loyalty and calm that Max always provided in times like this. "You did good, buddy," Jake muttered, a small smile tugging at his lips. But as much as he wanted to relax, Jake knew the fight wasn't over. Karen would be back. She'd try to find another way to get under his skin, to use her power to intimidate him into submission. But Jake wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't going to back down this time. The law had been on his side, and no matter what Karen tried next, he had a clear conscience. With Max still by his side, Jake turned toward the window, looking out at the neighborhood. He could still hear the distant hum of the police car, but it was starting to fade. The world outside was still the same, but things had changed for Jake. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace in his own home, knowing that he had fought back against the injustice that Karen had brought into his life. Jake wasn't just defending his property anymore. He was standing up for himself and for everyone who had been pushed around by people like Karen. He wasn't going to let her continue to use her position for personal gain. She had underestimated him, and now she had to deal with the consequences. There was still a long road ahead, but Jake was ready for whatever came next. He had learned a valuable lesson today. You don't let someone walk all over you, especially when you know you're in the right. Karen's son might have learned that lesson the hard way, but Jake had no intention of letting her forget it. With a final glance at the window, Jake turned away, his mind already planning his next move. He wasn't going to sit back and wait for Karen to make her next move. He was going to take charge and make sure she knew that he wouldn't back down. This wasn't just about one trespassing incident. It was about taking control of his life, and Jake was done letting Karen or anyone else take that from him. Jake paced the living room, his thoughts racing, but his feet were steady as he walked back and forth. The phone in his hand felt heavy, as though it were weighing down on him with the knowledge that Karen wasn't going to let this slide. He had known she would come after him somehow, but he hadn't expected her to react this quickly. His fingers hovered over the phone's screen, wondering if he should call his lawyer or prepare himself for whatever Karen might throw at him next. But before he could make any decision, the doorbell rang. Jake's stomach tightened. His first instinct was to ignore it, but something told him that it wasn't going to be an easy visit. He moved cautiously toward the door, glancing through the peephole. It was Karen. Of course, it was. She stood there, her arms crossed, her face filled with a mixture of anger and something darker, something that Jake could only describe as desperation. He took a deep breath and opened the door. "I knew you'd show up," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "But I didn't expect you to be this bold." Karen didn't hesitate. "You've made a huge mistake, Jake," she snapped, her tone sharp and filled with venom. "You think calling the cops on my son is going to make everything go away? You've just made things worse for yourself." Her words were sharp, but Jake stood his ground, his posture strong. "Your son broke into my house," he said, his voice unwavering. "He has to face the consequences." Karen's eyes flashed with anger, but Jake wasn't intimidated. He had faced her manipulations too many times to be afraid now. She had always used her position in the HOA to bully others, and now she was trying to use it to get her son off the hook. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Karen sneered. "You think you can just call the cops and expect them to fix everything for you?" "I didn't need the cops," Jake replied coolly. "I needed to protect my home. And I'm not about to let you or your son walk all over me anymore." Karen took a step closer, her face twisting with fury. "You've made a terrible mistake," she said, her voice low and threatening. "You've angered the wrong person, Jake. You have no idea what I can do." Jake didn't flinch. "You're not going to scare me with your threats, Karen," he said, his voice steady. "The law is on my side, and your son's actions have consequences. You can't protect him from this." Karen's smile was tight, her eyes narrowing as she took a step back. For a moment, Jake thought she might leave, but instead, she just stood there, seething. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice barely audible. "You'll regret this, Jake. You'll see." She turned to leave, but not before shooting him one last look. "I'll be seeing you soon," she muttered, her words filled with an ominous promise. Jake didn't respond. He didn't need to. The door shut behind her with a soft thud, and Jake stood there for a moment, his mind still spinning. He had expected this confrontation. He knew Karen wouldn't let things go easily, but the satisfaction of standing his ground, of seeing her leave without any power over him, gave him a strange sense of peace. He wasn't afraid anymore. But he knew this was far from over. Karen wasn't the type of person to give up easily, and now she was angry, angrier than she had ever been. And when Karen got angry, people usually got hurt. Jake glanced over at Max, who had been quietly watching the interaction from across the room. The dog gave a soft bark, almost as if in agreement. Jake nodded, as though acknowledging his companion's silent support. He knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but at least he had done what needed to be done. For now, Karen's son was behind bars, and that was a small victory in itself. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's next move would be even more dangerous. He wasn't sure what she would do, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her intimidate him any longer. This wasn't just about his house. It was about standing up to her, standing up for his rights, and making sure that no one, not even someone with as much influence as Karen, could bully him into submission. As Jake sank into his chair, his phone buzzed again. He picked it up, expecting another message from Karen, but it wasn't. It was from his lawyer, confirming that the legal process was moving forward. The charges against Karen's son were official. There was no backing out now. The law would run its course, and for once, Jake felt like he had the upper hand. He could feel the weight of the situation lift slightly, but he knew the battle wasn't over. The next round was coming, and he would be ready. Jake leaned back, taking a deep breath as he looked out the window. The world outside looked peaceful, but Jake knew the calm wouldn't last. Karen was coming for him, and she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. But Jake wasn't going to let her win. Not this time. The next few days passed in a blur, but the tension never fully left Jake's home. He couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was planning something. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart skipped a beat. Was it Karen? Was she going to make good on her promise to make him regret standing up to her? He tried to focus on his work, tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something was coming, but it was hard to ignore the storm brewing on the horizon. Then, late one afternoon, Jake received a phone call that made his blood run cold. It was from his lawyer, and when he answered, the first words were enough to stop him in his tracks. "Jake, you need to be careful," his lawyer said, his voice serious. "Karen's son isn't the only problem you're going to face." Jake felt a surge of unease. "What do you mean?" "Karen has pulled some strings," the lawyer continued. "She's using her connections in the HOA to put pressure on the authorities. She's trying to turn the situation around, make it look like you're the one in the wrong." Jake's mind raced. He had known Karen wouldn't give up easily, but this was different. What's she trying to do? Jake asked, his voice tight with frustration. "She's pushing for a lawsuit. She's accusing you of assault for the way you handled her son when he broke into your house." Jake's hands tightened around the phone, the anger rising in him like a wave. "That's insane. I didn't assault anyone." His lawyer was quiet for a moment before replying, "I know, Jake. But the accusations are serious. She's got the right people listening to her, and she's making it look like you overreacted. It's going to get ugly." Jake slammed his fist on the table, frustration boiling over. Karen's reach was endless, and now she was using every bit of power she had to turn this around. She didn't just want to intimidate him, she wanted to ruin him. "What can I do?" Jake asked, his voice grim. "We'll fight it in court," his lawyer replied. "But you need to prepare yourself. She's going to pull out all the stops to make you look bad." Jake's mind raced, but he didn't have time to process everything. He had to think fast, and he had to be smart. Karen wasn't going to get away with this. Not when he knew he was in the right. "Thanks for the heads up," Jake said, hanging up the phone with a heavy heart. As he sat there, the weight of what he was facing began to sink in. Karen wasn't just going to go away. She wasn't going to be satisfied with her son getting arrested. She would fight until the very end, and she would use anything at her disposal to make sure Jake was the one who paid the price. Jake stood up from the table, pacing back and forth in his living room. He couldn't let her win. He couldn't let her take everything from him. His mind raced through the possibilities, but one thing was clear: he had to take control of the situation. He needed to be proactive. He couldn't let Karen twist the story to fit her narrative. If she wanted to play dirty, he would, too. Jake's gaze fell on the window, and as the sun set, he knew what he had to do. He had to get ahead of Karen's next move. He couldn't wait for her to strike again. He needed to make sure he had everything in place, that he had the facts on his side. He couldn't let her manipulate him, twist the truth, or make him look like the bad guy. He wasn't going to sit back and let Karen's influence destroy him. He was ready for the fight ahead, and this time, he was going to make sure he was the one who came out on top. Jake's phone buzzed again. It was a text from his neighbor, confirming that Karen had been making waves in the neighborhood, rallying support and twisting the truth in her favor. The message was clear: Karen was already spreading her lies, making sure people believed she was the victim. Jake read the message over and over again, the anger building in his chest. But this time, it wasn't the anger of a man who had been wronged. This was the anger of a man who was ready to take back control, ready to expose Karen for the manipulative liar she was. He wasn't going to let her win. Not now, not ever. Jake sat back down at the table, his fingers tapping against the surface as he formulated a plan. He knew what he had to do. He had to fight back, and he had to do it in a way that would make Karen's lies impossible to ignore. The game was on, and this time, Jake was going to make sure he came out victorious. Jake could feel the pressure mounting as the days passed. Every phone call, every knock on the door made his heart race, but he kept his resolve. Karen wasn't just a neighborhood nuisance. She was a force to be reckoned with, and now that she was fighting back, Jake knew he had to stay one step ahead. His lawyer had confirmed that they would be heading to court soon, and Karen was already preparing her case. She had gathered witnesses, including some of her loyal HOA allies, who were all too eager to support her lies. But Jake wasn't intimidated. He had his own plan. He knew Karen had underestimated him, thought he would cower under her threats. What she didn't realize was that Jake wasn't just going to fight for his home. He was going to make sure that everyone saw her for the manipulative person she was. That evening, as Jake sat in his living room, reviewing some documents, the doorbell rang. His pulse quickened, but this time, there was no hesitation in his step. He was ready. When he opened the door, he wasn't surprised to see Karen standing there, her arms crossed, her expression as cold as ever. But today, there was something different in her eyes. A quiet fury that hinted at just how far she was willing to go. "We need to talk," Karen said, her voice dripping with forced politeness. Jake didn't invite her in, but he didn't shut the door either. He stood there, watching her. "What do you want, Karen?" he asked, his tone firm. She smirked, clearly trying to maintain control of the situation. "I'm here to offer you one last chance to drop everything," she said, her words laced with a threat that hung heavy in the air. "You back off, and this can all go away. You'll get your little victory, and we'll pretend this never happened. But keep pushing me, and I'll make sure your life is ruined." Jake didn't flinch. "You've been threatening me for weeks, but I'm not scared of you, Karen. This isn't about me backing down. This is about you facing the consequences of your own actions." Karen's smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered. "You really don't understand, do you?" she said, her voice low. "I can make sure your reputation is destroyed. Your career is ruined. All I have to do is tell the right people the right story, and you won't be able to do a thing about it." Jake met her gaze, unblinking. "You're welcome to try," he said, his voice calm. "But I've already got the law on my side, and I'm not backing down. You can't threaten me into submission." Karen's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Jake saw her true desperation. She had always thought she could control everything around her. She had used her position in the HOA to manipulate and intimidate, and she had done it without anyone ever questioning her. But Jake wasn't playing by her rules, and he wasn't afraid to stand up to her. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice shaking with anger. "I'll destroy you, Jake. I'll make sure you regret this." But Jake didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had already made his point. Karen was used to getting her way, but not anymore. He wasn't going to let her use her power to ruin him. "I think you should leave," Jake said, his voice steady. "And don't come back until you've learned how to respect other people's boundaries." Karen stood there for a moment, her fists clenched at her sides. The air between them crackled with tension, but Jake didn't back down. He was done being intimidated. Slowly, Karen turned and walked away, her steps heavy with frustration. As she left, Jake felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He had stood up to her, and she had backed down. But deep down, he knew the battle wasn't over. She would be back. She would try again. But next time, Jake was ready. He was going to make sure that Karen's manipulation didn't work anymore, and he wasn't going to let her or anyone else take what was his. Later that evening, Jake sat down with Max, his loyal companion, and took a deep breath. The weight of everything was starting to lift. Karen might have walked away for now, but Jake knew there would be more obstacles ahead. He had to stay focused, stay sharp. The road wasn't going to be easy, but Jake was done letting Karen have control over his life. With Max at his side, Jake was ready for whatever came next. He was done being the victim. It was time to take control, and this time, he wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way.